Hello again. So we're still reading Same Sun Here. We are starting on page 64 this time. So this is still River. River is still writing to Mina, and he told her about a problem, something really bad happening where he lives, and it's called mountain top removal. So the coal mining companies are taking off the tops of the mountains to get the coal out. So they're being very destructive, taking down all the trees, burning everything, and that creates a lot of problems for the people where River lives. So let's read more about what River has to say now. So we are on page 64 in the middle. River is continuing his letter to Mina. 12th of September 2008, one day later than the last letter we read. Dear Mina, I was going to go ahead and mail your letter, but then today happened, which I have to tell you about. Today in school, my science teacher, Mrs. Heap, was talking about cohesion and giving us instructions on this exercise we had to do in class, where we got into groups and tried to see how many drops of water we could get onto one penny. Right, while she was talking about this, I figured she'd probably know even more about mountaintop removal since she's a science teacher, so I raised my hand. She ignored me for a little while, but then she finally put her hands on her hips and looked aggravated and said, "Yes, River, what is so important?" I asked her if she could explain mountaintop removal to us. We're not going to talk about that right now, River. If you were paying attention, you'd know that. I never have liked that woman. She always sits and eats Skittles right in front of us, even though she knows we're not allowed to have any kind of candy at school. I think that says a lot about her. Plus, she wears too much perfume, and sometimes it gives people headaches. So then I said it was so important that maybe we ought to be talking about it. Well, fortunately, you don't dictate what gets talked about here, Mrs. Heap said, and laughed a little bit, looking at her daughter, who is also in my class and is the biggest snob in the entire school. She tells everybody she is rich, but Mama says that sometimes people just try to act rich, and they are actually in debt up to their eyeballs. And this must be the case with the Heaps, since they are both teachers, and teachers don't make squat. Mrs. Heap smiled in this real fake way and took a step towards me. Why are you so curious about it anyway? Because they're doing it to Town Mountain and a lot of other mountains. And my mama says that if something doesn't change, then every mountain we've got is going to be flattened if the coal companies have their way. Let me remind you, Mr. Justice, that lots of people in this country make their living by working in this county, make their living by working in the coal industry, she said. So your mama ought to mind her own business. Well, that made me real mad. I felt my face go red. And then I told her some of what Mama had told me the last night. I said that lots of people, like my very own daddy, had lost their jobs because MTR, mountaintop removal, uses more machines than it does people. And then I told her that my mama had said that this was our business. And if Americans hadn't spoken up for what they believed in, we'd still have slavery. And women wouldn't be able to vote. And besides that, we'd probably still be a colony of England instead of our own country. Right about there, Mrs. Heap started telling me to hush and kept coming closer and closer, slapping her pointer across her palm. But I couldn't hush. I felt like I had to say it all out to set her straight. I had to take up for Mama. So I just kept talking. The last thing I said was, Mama said that the only way to be a good American is to speak up for what you believe in. So Mrs. Heap sent me to the office for disrupting class. I had to wait forever in front of the office because the principal, Mr. Wright, was in the lunchroom breaking up a fight. He finally came in and looked down at me and said, "Let's go, son," and swung his arm through the air like a traffic cop, directing me into his office. I don't know. He thinks he's really cool, but I think he's a big turd. He wears his pants too tight, and the back part of his tie is always hanging lower than the front. And he is always fooling with his hair and checking himself out in windows or mirrors or anything that will show his reflection. He asked me all about the problem, and I told him exactly what had happened. And he just said I couldn't interrupt the teacher like that, and I needed to stay in after school detention. I got real mad. I couldn't help it. But I didn't do anything wrong, I said. He stood up and leaned over his desk and pointed his finger in my face and spoke in a tight little voice. "You better watch it there, buddy," he said, and widened his eyes at me. Then he said he was calling my mother. So I had to sit for half an hour and wait again. I had to sit there while he signed papers and read letters without ever saying a word to me or even looking at me. Once I asked him if I could get my copy of Old Yeller out of my locker so I wouldn't have to sit there and stare at my shoes, but he just said no without looking at me. I had to miss history class, which I really love. We were supposed to learn about the Boston Tea Party today. But after a while, here came Mama. I knew Mom wouldn't come. She hasn't left the house in ages. I was so glad to see her. But she didn't hug me or anything the way she usually did. She just shot me a funny look, like, "What have you done?" And sat down and put her big pocketbook up on her knees and asked Mr. Wright what was the problem. River here interrupted class today by refusing to stop questioning the teacher today. Mr. Wright said he had his elbows up on the chair arms and was touching all 10 fingertips together the whole time he talked. For the first time, I noticed he had sleep in the corner of his eyes. What's that stuff here? It was brown. Well, that's not like him. He usually has awful good manners, Mama said, looking at me like I ought to give her some kind of clue as to what was happening. What were you questioning her about, River? I was trying to get her to tell us about mountaintop removal, and she wouldn't. Mama told the principal that seemed like a perfectly good question to ask the science teacher. Mountaintop removal is a controversial topic in these parts, as you well know, Mr. Wright said, and it's not appropriate for teachers to be talking about with students. So controversial means that people are arguing and fighting about it. So one side, they love mountaintop removal. The other side hates mountaintop removal. Why? Probably for jobs, money, business. So Mama on page 69 says, if it's controversial, then why? That's exactly why she should be talking about it with them, Mama said. Mr. Wright said, perhaps I ought to wait out front. Perhaps I ought to wait out front. But Mama said no. She didn't protect her children or grandchildren from the truth. Tell me exactly what happened, River. So once again, I had to tell it. And by the time I got to the part where Mrs. Heap told me that Mama ought to mind her own business, I could tell that Mama's blood was boiling. So she turned to Mr. Wright and said she wanted to speak to Mrs. Heap with him. He sighed and started to make up some kind of excuse. But Mama said, I want to see this woman right now. So he picked up the phone and called her to the office. And that's when Mama turned to me and said, that maybe it was a good idea for me to wait out front so she could talk properly to Mrs. Heap. When it was all over, Mrs. Heap was the first one out of the door. She shot past me, her arm swinging as she walked away, huffing and puffing. Mr. Wright said I could go back to class and there would be no after-school detention. Mama winked at me and said she'd see me later. So I went back to class, but I couldn't concentrate on anything at all. During my chorus class, Mrs. Heap came in and whispered something to the ear of the teacher, Mrs. Greer. Then they both looked right at me. They are real good friends. So Mrs. Heap was probably in there telling her to give me a hard time. And when I got home, the bulldozers were even louder. After supper, salmon patties and soup beans, which I love, we walked back out to the high cliffs, and you wouldn't believe how much damage they've done in one day. It made me want to throw up. We stood there in the sun setting so red and orange, but it seemed like a whole world was on fire. And for a long time, Mama didn't say anything. Something about it reminded me of when your grandmother said, God is great, during that big thunderstorm. Because it was like Mama's silence was saying that very same thing while we looked out on the good mountains and the one that was being destroyed. I can't even talk about it anymore. I'm sorry that I've written such a depressing letter, but I had to tell you all of that. Okay, page 72, 13th of September, 2008, Saturday. So it's the next day. Dear Mina, I was going to mail your letter this morning, but then one good thing happened and I wanted to tell you about it so they wouldn't have to send a letter full of bad stuff. This morning I went in and sat with Mom a while. She was in agony with a headache and couldn't even talk to me. I rubbed her temples for a while and read a whole chapter of Old Yeller out loud to her. I think that made her feel better. She kissed me on the cheek and told me to go play. But I went to the grocery store with Mama instead. And sure enough, as soon as we got to the Piggly Wiggly, there was Dr. Patel and his wife. Dr. Patel started laughing and threw his arms out for a hug and said, Mama Justice! And Mama hugged him and they talked and went on. And his wife leaned over just a bit and smiled at me. Hello, young man, she said. Meeting you gave me the courage to talk to her, so I said hello. And then I asked her what her name is. It's Chandra. What does that mean? She told me I could call her that and not Mrs. Patel. Then I told her I have a pen pal from the mountains of India who now lives in New York City, and she seemed real pleased by that. She asked which mountains, but I'm sorry I couldn't remember, so I just said the ones that look like these. And she laughed a little and she said she was from Ahmedabad. I had to ask her to repeat it a couple times, and finally she said, here. And she held out her palm and wrote it with blue ink pen so I could see. I told her I wanted to be sure to tell you where she was from, and so she wrote it on my palm too, holding on my fingers with her other hand. Her skin was very warm and she smiled the whole time she wrote it. She was leaning down close to my face, so I got to stare at her bindi real close. You were right, because hers is made of felt, just like your mom's. Mama was finally finishing laughing with Dr. Patel, so Chandra put out her hand to shake mine. I'm very pleased to meet you, River Justice, she said. I'm always glad to make a new friend. She has really brown eyes that stare right into you. I liked her a lot. I wanted to let you know that I have 2 Indian friends, all because of one, you. I'm looking forward to your next letter. Sincerely, River Dean Justice. Okay, so a lot is happening in River's life. A lot of bad things are happening in River's life, but now he has 2 Indian friends. Stay tuned and we'll see what Mina's going to write about her life. Take care. Bye.